thanks for coming, everybody. So this is the seminar that kicks off our seminar series for scientific machine learning. So we're gonna have we hope to have one speaker every month, and so the theme is scientific machine learning, broadly conceived. So, you know, applying scientific engineering first principles to machine learning methods. So combining scientific computation and machine learning. And we have a website for our scientific machine learning lab. And, you know, it's still in progress, but it will be version 1.0 will be released very soon. And I'll try to advertise that. And so part of the effort is this seminar series. We're going to try to have one every month, like I said. And our first one couldn't be better. Okay, so we have Paris, who is assistant professor at UPenn, and he was working at Brown and also at MIT, right, as a postdoc.
Yep.
And at Brown, he was working he was one of the pioneers of this application of deep neural networks to physical problems. He is author of the paper now with 2,000 citations, almost 2,000 citations by now, in over 2 years, which is the physically informed neural network paper with Raisi and Kamiadakis. And so, I mean, we are very happy to have him. This couldn't be a better kickoff to our seminar series. So I really appreciate, Paris, that you accepted our invitation. And with that, I'm going to give the floor to you, and we're really looking forward to this.
All right, fantastic. Let me share my screen. Hopefully you can see my slides. So let me start by thanking Ulysses for the invitation. It's really an honor to kick off the seminar series. It's very exciting to me to see that this line of work, or physics-informed neural networks, is reaching far. And I know that already your group has done excellent work and has made really nice contributions to this area. Today, I will just try to give you a high-level overview for the people in the audience that may not be so familiar with what we mean by physics-informed deep learning. And I will also highlight some open challenges and that we're trying to address. Primarily, I will show you some work of one of my students, Sifan Wan, which I think he's also attending the seminar. So if you have any questions, we really have Sifan online that he could probably help go into the technical details. And also some additional applications in collaboration with my postdoc, Aziz Buri, on applications of this framework to modeling the spread of COVID-19. So without any delay, let me just give you an overview of today's talk. And we'll start with some high-level introduction of what is physics-informed machine learning and how it is aspiring to transform computational science. And then we'll have a technical part on how to make neural networks physics-informed, with a specific focus on overcoming some challenges that arise in the process of constraining neural networks to satisfy a set of given physical laws expressed typically in the form of systems of partial differential equations. And in the end, hopefully we'll have some time to go through some application highlights that showcase the effectiveness or the capabilities of those models in more realistic settings. All right, so let me just start by stating that nowadays it's really exciting to be working in computational science, because we're really building on the shoulders of giants to exploit the power of computing to resolve major challenges on the frontiers of engineering, natural, and life sciences. So what you see here in this slide is just a collection of really impressive simulation studies conducted at different institutions, some aerospace applications in NASA, a really beautiful computational study by Petros Koumoutsakos' group at ETH, who recently moved to Harvard, on simulating millions of red blood cells through a microfluidic channel in order to identify a small number of tumor cells that are flowing along with the red blood cells. And even simulations in the energy sector, you see large simulations of wind farms, so turbulent flow through a farm of wind turbines conducted at Johns Hopkins University with the goal of optimizing the design of those wind turbines. So really simulation is becoming an indispensable tool in science and engineering to inform design and decision making. And even though the applications you see in this slide are very different from one another, the underlying principles of how computation is performed are fairly common, in the sense that in all cases, the starting point is a model that describes our understanding of the natural phenomena under study. So this model typically takes the form of a system of partial differential equations. Here U will denote the latent solution that we need to solve for, and F could be some general nonlinear operator that may depend on some unknown parameters phi. And the second step would be to assume some representation for this unknown solution. In classical computational science, typically we will try to discretize the continuous function in a finite dimensional setting, which will make things amenable to computing. And a standard choice would be to choose some set of features, namely here phi I. A common choice would be some fixed basis of polynomials, and then essentially try to infer what are the unknown coefficients wi that multiply this basis to construct the latent solution. So there's an additional building block that we need to come up with appropriate numerical solvers for computing those quantities that parameterize our solution. And if we are able to do that successfully, then we should be able to predict that unknown function u at new arbitrary spatial or temporal locations denoted by x and t using our calibrated model. Now, obviously, in every step of this process, there is a series of assumptions that come into play. What is the choice of discretization? What is the choice of the numerical solver? Each of those assumptions introduces uncertainty and also approximation errors. So in order to close the loop, we need to validate the results. So there comes the role of observational data in giving us a mechanism to compare our model predictions with some reference solution or some ground truth solution, measure the discrepancy between the two, and essentially define a closed loop where we're using that discrepancy to go back to the drawing board and perhaps calibrate our model or refine our assumptions and the parameters that we've chosen. So this is really, in a nutshell, the workflow across many applications of computational science and engineering. The focus of today's talk, however, is to really highlight some challenges associated with this workflow that pose the need or highlight the opportunity of where machine learning techniques can come into play. So traditional approaches to computational science and engineering, such as the simulations that you saw earlier that are based using either particle methods or finite element methods, they've really undergone remarkable progress, but they still operate under stringent requirements. First of all, they require precise knowledge of the underlying governing laws that express conservation of constitutive relationships. They also require precise knowledge of boundary or initial conditions that are needed to simulate those models. And oftentimes they are associated with very time-consuming workflows. So for example, meshes need to be generated, data needs to be pre-processed, long simulation times and supercomputing resources might be needed, and then also visualization, post-processing, and so forth. On top of that, and another layer of complexity arises when we need to assimilate observational data in this workflow. Essentially, this defines inverse problems in which the simulator would be we need to use the simulator multiple times within some optimization loop in order to calibrate or discover missing parts in the model or calibrate parameters. And therefore that optimization loop can become prohibitively expensive, especially given the fact that we might need to take gradients through our simulation to backpropagate sensitivities. And obviously, as I mentioned, there's a series of assumptions that introduce free parameters and sources of uncertainty. And in many realistic scenarios, we might be living in this interesting regime where maybe parts of our model may not be known. So we have some knowledge of the physics, and maybe we have some observational data. And the question is, how do we synthesize the two? So in this real life setting where models could be incomplete and data can be imperfect, traditional approaches to computational science face a large number of challenges and may become very, very costly to deploy in practice. And this is really where the opportunity arises for using observational data and machine learning in this workflow. So let me just give you an example of one of the most recent success stories of machine learning that comes from the systems biology domain. And this is a system developed by Google DeepMind. It's essentially a deep learning pipeline with the goal of predicting protein structure, three-dimensional protein structure, given a sequence of amino acids that essentially defines the protein. Obviously, this is a very complex combinatorial problem. It's a very high-dimensional regression problem, if you wish. And there is a very complex architecture that that team has designed to achieve this task. But it really highlights the capabilities of deep learning in tackling those complex high-dimensional prediction tasks. It also highlights the starvation of deep learning tools for training data. So for this particular example, this model was led to breakthrough results. However, it had to be trained on 170,000 examples that were annotated. So that would be 170,000 examples for which the mapping from protein sequence to 3D structure is precisely known. And on top of this supervised data set, they also considered a much larger data set containing unsupervised examples, namely 3D structures for which the protein sequence may not be known, or protein sequences for which the 3D structure may not be known. So in many applications in science and engineering, we simply cannot afford to have data sets that are this large. And that setting of scarce and limited data oftentimes poses a challenge to the applicability of machine learning and specifically deep learning techniques that are known for their starvation for data and their poor performance in the small data regime. Now, moving forward, that sort of poses the need for what I call physics-informed machine learning. But before we go to the definitions of what that is, let me show you maybe a vision or an example of where the two worlds of computational science and machine learning could be combined. So what you see here is a beautiful animation. It's a beautiful data set containing an ECG-gated MRI of a heart beating in real time. And as you can notice, there is very nice detail of the blood flow, the motion of the arterial wall. So there's quite a bit of information present in this data set. And such data sets are routinely collected nowadays. So really our ability to collect and create data like this outpaces our ability to sensibly assimilate it, let alone understand it. So here's a set of futuristic questions. Looking at this data set here, could we try to infer constitutive laws for the arterial wall mechanics or for the blood rheology? Could we try to automatically segment the geometry of the vessels that are moving and dilating? Can we reconstruct the flow in a way that our reconstruction satisfies certain physical principles like conservation of mass or momentum? On top of that, could we make predictions about quantities that are not measurable through imaging techniques like the blood pressure or the wall shear stresses, which are known to be important biomarkers for characterizing certain cardiovascular pathologies? Even further, if we have a model that can synthesize all this information, can we use that model to test interventions or generalize to a new scenario, or even help us select what additional information is needed to refine our understanding of the system? So all these are futuristic questions that cannot really be answered with the current set of tools out there, but they really pose the need for computational frameworks that could actually operate under this realistic setting, under these realistic complex data sets, and help us bridge what we already know in terms of our mathematical and physical understanding of the world and what we observe in reality through these complex data modalities that we are acquiring. So with that, I will go ahead and claim that physics-informed machine learning is an area that aspires to produce tools in operating under this setting. And let me start by just defining what I mean by physics-informed machine learning. And by the way, if there's any questions, feel free to unmute your microphones and interrupt me, because usually I don't have, I don't see the notifications in the chat. So just a simple definition here, what do I mean by physics-informed machine learning? Well, we will refer to the process by which prior knowledge stemming from our observational, empirical, or physical understanding of the world can be leveraged to improve the performance of a learning algorithm. Okay, so that's a definition, but what are we really trying to achieve here is we want to build models that will increase our flexibility in synthesizing incomplete models with observational data. And we hope that by doing so, by leveraging this prior physical information, we'll be able to build models that have strong generalization performance in the small data regime. So, which is currently a setting where standard deep learning tools in particular face challenges. On the other hand, we would like to leverage the ability of deep learning models to approximate functions even in high dimensions and in complex settings, therefore giving us a path to mitigating or lifting the curse of dimensionality in certain scenarios. Now the question is, what are the principles, what are the mechanisms for taking a machine learning algorithm and constraining it to satisfy the underlying physics? Well, there's three basic principles. The first one, denoted here by observational bias, inductive bias, and learning bias. So by observational bias will mean the process by which we will try to encourage a learning algorithm to satisfy the underlying physics through the use of training data that embody and reflect the physical principles. So the hope here is if we train a learning system using a large number of data that contains the information about the underlying physics, then one would hope that this observational bias will constrain the predictions of this learning system to approximately be physically consistent. However, this is perhaps the less preferred mode of biasing your machine learning model because it would really require large amounts of data. And as we mentioned, in many domains, we cannot really afford them. Now, the second principle is related to inductive bias, and that boils down to carefully designing specialized priors and architectures that implicitly reflect the underlying physics. So for example, if you wish to build a machine learning system that predicts the energy of a molecule, well, then you should try to make sure that that system is invariant with respect to rotations or translations of the molecular configuration, because we know that physically the energy is an invariant quantity with respect to those symmetry groups. So if you have a set of known symmetry groups, you can try to be very careful in how you design your architectures such that your predictions are invariant with respect to the symmetry groups. In many cases, this is possible, but also in many other cases, those symmetry groups may a priori be unknown, for instance, in fluid flows or turbulence. Therefore, it will be really hard to design architectures that implicitly satisfy the physics in this sense. The last school of thought is biasing your method through learning bias, and that amounts to enforcing the physics using penalty constraints during the training phase of your model. So maybe you can start with a generic architecture like a multi-layer perceptron or a convolutional neural network model, and then try to formulate loss functions that will approximately penalize the physics during model training. And essentially, this last school of thought is what will lead us now to discussing about physics-informed neural networks. But before we do so, let me just make the point that the general workflow of computational science that I presented earlier still holds and still remains the same, However, what changes here is that instead of using a fixed basis of polynomials to represent our solution, we might be using some parameterized model like a deep neural network. And then instead of using numerical methods for solving for the coefficients of our basis, we'll be using statistical inference principles like maximum likelihood estimation or Bayesian inference to try to calibrate our model parameters, namely here the parameters theta that parameterize our representation of the latent solution, and the parameters phi that parameterize our model, and we'll try to infer them through data using statistical inference principles. So these are the two key points that really are different from the standard paradigm in scientific computing. And in fact, we have an upcoming review paper that will appear in Nature in the next month or so on discussing these principles of physics-informed machine learning. Now with that, let me jump to the next topic and introduce what we refer to as physics-informed neural networks, that, as I mentioned, represent this last school of thought related to learning bias. So we'll try to enforce physics explicitly by constraining the output of conventional architectures to satisfy the underlying governing laws. This line of work is not new. So those ideas that I will present, they really date back to the early 90s when people actually for the first time tried to use neural networks to solve ordinary or partial differential equations. And really what has changed since the 90s to now is the implementation aspect. So back in the 90s, people would really have to sit down and derive manually the backpropagation rules for those constrained neural networks, whereas nowadays we rely on automatic differentiation to compute any gradients of the network with respect to its parameters or with respect to its inputs. And really this is what changed. And the paper we wrote with Mazia Raisi and Jos Karniadakis, essentially that was the main contribution. So the ideas were old, but it's really the implementation frameworks that that are new, and essentially they are allowing us nowadays to tackle more complex tasks than what was possible back in the 90s. So let's focus on what we refer to as physics-informed neural networks. So here the starting point is that we are dealing with systems that can be described by partial differential equations, and we'll use neural networks to represent the unknown solution to this differential equation. So namely, we'll use a neural net that takes as input space or time coordinates denoted as x and t, and produces some prediction U hat that aims to represent the unknown solution of the PDE. And by recognizing that this representation is differentiable, we can take derivatives of that neural network with respect to its input coordinates, and then build those residual operators for penalizing the discrepancy between the predicted output and the residual of the PDE or the fitting of the boundary conditions. So this allows us to essentially formulate a composite or a multitask learning problem. We have a composite loss function, which at the same time is trying to fit any observed data. Those could be initial or boundary conditions or some measurements inside the domain of interest. And at the same time, encourage the outputs of the neural network to satisfy the underlying system of differential equations by minimizing the residual of those equations for that given prediction of the network. So at the end of the day, we'll have some loss function, and we'll try to minimize it with respect to the network parameters using gradient descent. And in this entire workflow, all gradients with respect to model parameters, but also with respect to input coordinates, will be computed through automatic differentiation. So some notation here to just summarize what I just said. Again, we'll be using a neural net to represent the solution of a PDE. Consequently, we can actually compute the residual of that equation if we plug in the neural net representation here denoted by f of theta. Theta knows the parameters, the weights and the biases of that neural net. And therefore we can, by computing that residual, we can form loss functions that try to penalize simultaneously data fit, the PDE residual, and also fitting the initial or boundary conditions. And everything, then we just pray to the gods of non-convex optimization, and we try to minimize this loss function to identify a set of parameters that leads to a network that fits the observed data, but at the same time approximately minimizes the PDE residual. And obviously the residual will never be zero, therefore I'm using the word approximately here. All right, so that's an overview. Let me give you a worked out example just to see an example setting where those tools can be used. And in this case, we'll try to use physics-informed neural networks to infer the constitutive law of a non-Newtonian fluid given some velocity measurements of that fluid. So essentially here we'll consider a flow in a channel, so a flow between two parallel plates, and we'll assume some prior model for our fluid flow, namely that at steady state we have momentum conservation, where here u of y denotes the velocity across the profile of the channel, and mu of u will denote a viscosity that is shear rate dependent. So the viscosity here depends on the underlying velocity. Now the question is, if somebody gives us measurements, noisy measurements of the velocity, can we infer this unknown viscosity, so this function mu of u? So that defines an inverse problem. And in fact, you can actually employ physics-informed neural networks, in this case, two networks, one to model the velocity function and one to model the viscosity function. And then you can use, on one hand, the observed data. You can try to fit the velocity network to the observed data, but at the same time, you can try to minimize the residual of your prior model that describes momentum conservation. So by doing so, you can formulate a loss function for optimizing the parameters of those two neural networks here, namely theta and gamma. And if you're able to do so, now you have a network that can fit the observed data, but also can infer what is the underlying viscosity of the fluid according to the model that we just assumed, right? So this is a very simple example to sort of showcase the application of physics-informed neural networks in a toy problem, toy inverse problem in fluid mechanics. Now, let me show you another more impressive application that was actually not performed in our group, but a team at NVIDIA, so the leading manufacturer of GPU cards, is actually using physics-informed neural networks to optimize the design of heat sinks that are used to cool down their GPU hardware. Essentially, they're using now physics-informed neural networks to emulate this coupled system of fluid dynamics and heat transfer and try to perform automatic exploration of the design space in order to optimize the geometry of the heat sinks that you see in this animation. So this is a very simple design problem. Essentially, they parameterize the heat sink using two design variables. Maybe we can see here, we have the edge fin and the center fin. These are two variable parameters that define a family of possible shapes for that cooling device. And then the objective function here would be to minimize this pressure over temperature ratio, the pressure drop over temperature, to identify the optimal design. So essentially now they augment their physics-informed neural networks using those additional design variables, and they can train a PINS model to emulate the system and try to perform gradient-based optimization to identify what would be the optimal design that, that maximizes their performance objective. And in fact, they were able to do so. They have a very nice use case, and they comparing the benefits of doing that as opposed to using commercial software for simulating electronics cooling and performing optimization. You see a pretty significant decrease in the design iterations or the cost needed for tackling this design problem using neural nets versus the conventional approach. All right, so I think this is all I have in terms of success stories. I don't know if there's any questions. That was sort of the first part of the talk. Then we'll move to slightly more technical part to highlight some of the open challenges. But if you have any questions, feel free to interrupt me and ask. All right, so let me move on and just state here again that PINS are introducing a new paradigm for synthesizing observational data and physical laws. There has been a growing collection of impressive results reported in the literature across diverse applications and disciplines. In fact, nowadays there are too many to be listed, so I'm omitting many nice contributions here. However, physics-informed neural networks tend to exhibit two fundamental pathologies that are most pronounced for forward problems. And by that, I mean the scenario where somebody gives us a partial differential equation and we're trying to use neural nets as a solver to predict the solution of that equation. And those pathologies are related to, first of all, a convergence, a tendency to converge towards low frequency functions when those neural nets are trained through gradient descent. And that pathology is a general pathology that is well understood or well appreciated in deep learning and referred to as spectral bias. So essentially, that's a limitation that we inherit by the fact that we're using neural nets and we train them by gradient descent. And the second fundamental issue here is that there's a discrepancy in the convergence rates between different components in the loss function of a physics-informed neural network model that eventually leads to stiff gradient flows and vanishing gradients during training. So many times you might encounter difficulties in training these PINS models, and the training might collapse, and you may not be able to get a sensible model out of the training process. So these limitations require us to take a step back and rethink on the assumptions that we make. Perhaps using a black box optimizer like the Adam optimizer may not be the right thing here, or perhaps the way the model is initialized needs to be revisited and so forth. So there's a lot of things we need to consider. And let me just show you a very simple example where things are failing. So this is a wave equation in one space dimension. So a wave propagation problem subject to appropriate initial and boundary conditions. To solve this problem with PINS, would have to formulate a loss function that has three terms. Term number one is trying to fit the initial condition data for the unknown function and its derivative. And then the last term is trying to penalize the residual of the equation. And then no matter what you do here, you can try different architectures, different optimizers, tune hyperparameters, change the activation functions. You'll have a really hard time making physics-informed neural network models recover and approximate the correct solution here. So on the left-hand side, you see the correct ground truth solution. And then next to it is the prediction of a plain multi-layer perceptron network trained using the Adam optimizer. And you see that the prediction really collapses, and there's very large prediction errors. And if you examine really the training behavior of this model on the right panel, you see that the model has a really, really hard time fitting the initial conditions for the function u. It's able to minimize the residual and the initial conditions for the time derivative, but it cannot fit the initial conditions and the boundary conditions for the target function. So obviously this is disturbing, and it really requires us to revisit some of the assumptions and rethink the problem setup. In recent work in our group, and this is work led by my student Sifan Wang, we're actually trying to study the behavior or the training dynamics of neural networks at the asymptotic limit of infinite width. And the reason we do so is because there are some really nice connections between wide neural networks and kernel methods. And it turns out that the behavior or the training dynamics of deep learning models can be greatly simplified in this asymptotic limit. In fact, they can be described by a kernel called the neural tangent kernel that can fully characterize the behavior of neural networks during training under gradient descent. Now, the neural tangent kernel here, I'm denoting it in the right-hand side of the slide, can be basically computed by taking the Jacobian of your neural network evaluated at some point x and x prime, and essentially it measures how sensitive the outputs of your neural network are at some location x, subject to prediction errors at some other location x prime. So let me just continue here and give you the main highlight. Perhaps I'm skipping a slide, so maybe I can go to this slide first. And the main utility of this analysis is that, in fact, we can use the neural tangent kernel or its eigen decomposition, given that it is a symmetric positive definite operator, to actually express the training error in terms of the eigenvalues and eigenfunctions of this NTK kernel. So essentially that shows us and that reveals the spectral bias issue that neural networks suffer from, that indeed the neural networks have the tendency to learn the target function along the eigendirection, along the dominant eigendirections of their limiting NTK. Now, in practice, it turns out that those dominant eigendirections correspond to eigenvectors with low frequencies. So that immediately tells us that neural networks have a preference to learn low frequency functions and have a hard time converging to higher frequency components. Essentially, you have to train for much, much longer with much smaller learning rates and using a lot of data in order to recover those high frequency components in the target function. So that's obviously a limitation, and that's really one of the key factors that prevents the use of neural networks in this PINS framework for cases that we need to approximate high frequency or multi-scale solutions of PDEs. So obviously we need to come up with some way around this limitation. Now, to do so, first of all, we test the hypothesis, and indeed we confirm that PINs suffer from spectral bias, and to do so, we have to derive the corresponding neural tangent kernel of physics-informed neural network models. The starting point here is the gradient flow dynamics, basically the continuous version of the gradient descent. And through that, we can actually derive a closed system that governs the evolution of the outputs of your neural networks, the joint evolution of the outputs and the PD residual. And we can express that in terms of this operator K that consists of 4 different blocks corresponding to the different interactions between the boundary terms and the residual terms. So KUU here denotes the NTK of the boundary loss. KRR denotes the corresponding NTK operator of the residual loss. And then you have the cross terms in the off diagonals. And on the bottom of the slide, essentially, you see how those NTK matrices are computed by simply taking the Jacobian of your neural network output or the corresponding Jacobian of the residual. And I should stress out that this formulation here is valid for any ODE or PDE system that you're considering and any neural network architecture. So no matter the architecture or the underlying PDE, you can always derive the corresponding NTK. Now, the interesting thing, as I said, is that you can use this NTK to analyze the convergence of the training error. And if you do so, that reveals the second fundamental pathology of physics-informed neural networks that relates to the discrepancy in the convergence rate between different terms in the loss function. So beyond spectral bias, PINS models also suffer from this discrepancy of convergence rate. And in fact, you can see that by examining the spectrum of the different components in the NTK operator. So here you see for a toy problem, the spectrum of the NTK operator K, but also the corresponding sub-blocks for the NTK of the boundary loss and the NTK of the residual loss. And what you can observe here is that the residual loss, the maximum eigenvalue of the NTK residual loss is 2 orders of magnitude larger than the one of the boundary loss. So that indicates a strong preference. If you were to train this neural net through gradient descent, that network would have a preference to quickly minimize the residual loss, but will have a really hard time minimizing the boundary loss. And essentially, this is what we observed in the failure case that I showed you earlier. The network had a hard time fitting the boundary conditions, and therefore it had a hard time recovering the correct PDE solution for that problem. And obviously, this is a limitation that needs to be addressed. So essentially, what I just mentioned poses the need for engineering novel architectures that perhaps can mitigate or overcome spectral bias and allow us to approximate high frequency or multi-scale functions more efficiently. But also it poses the need for new optimization algorithms that go beyond Adam or gradient descent that do not exhibit these convergence pathologies that are evident in this multitask setting. Now, motivated by those 2 questions and those 2 limitations, in recent work, again, led by Sifan Wang, we have designed architectures that employ coordinate embeddings in order to design neural networks that can efficiently learn high frequency or multi-scale functions. So this is motivated by some recent developments on using Fourier feature embeddings. And as you see here, basically the only thing we do is we take the inputs of the neural network and project them into a higher dimensional embedding space comprised of trigonometric features. And then we give those features as inputs to our neural network. And it turns out that by doing so, in fact, we can use physics-informed neural networks to solve PDEs that exhibit multi-scale behavior, that, like this example reaction diffusion system that you see in the slide, where conventional PINS models have a really hard time tackling. So obviously the open question here is what would be the right set of optimal coordinate embeddings, and that relates to the, the long-standing question of what is a good basis to represent the solution of your problem. And in fact, you may need to consider different types of features to resolve high frequencies or boundary layers or other type of behavior that your solution may exhibit. And you can find more details on a preprint we have on the archive. Now, the second limitation with respect to the convergence, the discrepancy, can be addressed through designing appropriate optimization algorithms for training physics-informed neural networks. And here, in this work, we draw inspiration from classical methods for integrating stiff ODE systems that rely on multi-rate solvers. And we essentially modify the objective of our physics-informed neural network to include some different weight parameters for balancing the effect of the different loss terms. So here we'll be introducing some parameters lambda b and lambda r in our loss function. Those parameters are constant, but may change during training, so during the iterations of gradient descent, so they do not really depend on space locations, but they could be dependent on the iteration index of our gradient descent algorithm. And instead of manually tuning those parameters through trial and error, we have come up with an automated way of tuning them that is grounded on this NTK theory that I just described earlier. And basically the goal is to set those parameters and choose those parameters such that we balance the spectra of the underlying NTK operators corresponding to the boundary loss and the residual loss. So as such, we're trying to resolve this discrepancy in the NTK spectra and try to rebalance them in a way that every term in our loss function will be converging at a similar rate. So, and we won't have one term dominating over the other. And essentially, the final step is just a standard gradient descent step over this objective that has now been reweighted using those parameters lambda b and lambda r, which are updated during training. They can be updated at every iteration of the training, or every 10 iterations, or every 100 iterations. It's actually, that is fairly flexible. So let me just revisit that problem that failed in view of what I just mentioned. And basically, we will just revisit this problem by employing a multi-scale Fourier feature architecture and use this adaptive weights algorithm that balances the NTK spectrum. So what you see here is exactly the same problem, but now you have a PINS model that can actually recover the true underlying solution. The actual network architecture is almost the same, except for the fact that we're using this Fourier feature embedding layer that does not contain any trainable parameters. And on the optimization side, we're introducing those trainable adaptive weights, those adaptive weights that are adapted using the NTK of our PINS model. And you see that those weights quickly converge to a plateau after a few iterations of gradient descent. And as you see in the bottom right plot, their role is really to balance the spectrum of the independent NTK blocks, namely the NTK corresponding to the boundary conditions for the solution and the time derivative, and also the NTK corresponding to the residual loss. You see the dashed lines are now, the maximum eigenvalue corresponding to the dashed lines now matches, whereas without the adaptive weights, you see a very large discrepancy in the spectra of those three NTK operators. So using those developments, nowadays we can tackle increasingly more complex cases using PINS. And in the final minutes of this presentation, let me show you some realistic applications that we have been working on where those techniques have proven to be effective. So the first one relates to the fact that this seminar has to take place online, and unfortunately I cannot visit the campus. So it has to do with studying COVID-19 dynamics and how the virus spreads across the US. And here we'll take a simple modeling approach, and we'll employ a very simple epidemiology model, namely the SEIR model that essentially considers 4 population compartments that model the susceptible, exposed, infected, and removed populations. And we'll try to use real data collected by Google and Unicast to try to predict essentially the number of cumulative cases across different counties in the US. So we have data from 203 different counties. And essentially the main contribution here is to formulate a simple epidemiology model. However, we will make the assumption that a key parameter, namely the infectious transition rate beta, is not a constant parameter, but is actually a function of parameters that characterize human mobility and social behavior. So basically, this SCIR model has some free parameters, namely gamma, beta, and delta. So gamma and delta are disease-specific parameters. However, beta is a parameter that really relates to human behavior and how human interactions sort of accelerate or can decelerate the spreading of the virus. So here we'll use this data collected by Google on that characterize human mobility and behavioral trends. So you see here the plot on the right. Essentially, this data captures differences against the baseline before COVID on how people aggregate in retail and recreational spaces, groceries or pharmacies, parks, workplaces, residential areas, and so forth. And then using these human mobility and behavior parameters, we'll try to calibrate this simple epidemiology model on available data on the cumulative cases. So this is one of the great challenges here in modeling real COVID-19 dynamics, and relates to the fact that you don't have reliable data for all the state variables in this, even for the simple epidemiology model. So we don't really have reliable data on the susceptible compartment or the infected compartment or the removed compartment. We can only really rely on data on the cumulative cases, namely, the cases that include the infected and the removed population, that includes the deceased individuals and the recovered individuals. So basically, we only have observed data for a single state variable, and then the other states are latent. So essentially here, what we did is we employed a physics-informed neural network to, and along with a recurrent neural network for modeling this beta parameter. And essentially we have this hybrid framework that on one hand, we want to use the epidemiology model as a prior, but on the other hand, we can employ an LSTM model to try to fit this unknown beta function to the observed mobility and behavioral data. And by doing so, we can actually fit observations of COVID-19 spread dynamics. So maybe I can show this slide first. So here you can see this study was performed a few months ago, so it was really referring to the early stages of COVID-19 spread. So the data we had was, I think, up until June or July 2020. And you see here the training data that was used to train the model correspond to the first 63 days, I believe, or 65 days. And then we're using the remaining data to validate the model prediction. So what you see here, the blue and the red curves indicate the total number of cumulative cases in different counties, including Philadelphia, Hartford, and counties in Arizona, Virginia, and Louisiana. And also the black curve indicates the basic reproduction number of the disease as predicted by our trained model. So on one hand, that you see that the model can fit the trajectories of the observed cumulative cases. On the other hand, the variability we observe on R0 can reflect the effect of different government policies that took place within this time window. So namely the red and the blue vertical dashed lines indicate the dates where the gathering bans and stay-at-home orders took effect in those different counties. And essentially you see a 2-week delay in the reduction, in the decrease of the basic reproduction number of the disease taking place 2 or 3 weeks after those government policies came into effect. Now, having a model, obviously we can try to use that model to perform future forecasts. And as you see here, with quantified uncertainty, we can give reasonable forecasts of of how the cumulative cases evolve in a window of 2 or 3 weeks after the model has been trained. And at the same time, we can actually try to assess what is the sensitivity of those spread dynamics on those human mobility and behavioral parameters. So in fact, you can perform a sensitivity analysis and see which are the most important human mobility and behavioral factors that contribute into the disease spread. And thankfully, this analysis basically confirmed the basic principles that the CDC has been communicating, namely that aggregation in closed spaces like retail, recreation, workplaces, and residential spaces are the most important factors contributing to the spread of the disease. So designing policies that limit those gatherings should be the most effective way of containing the spread of the disease, from a human mobility and behavior perspective. Moreover, we try to compare the model predictions against a purely data-driven model that does not use physics, or it does not use the simple epidemiology model as a baseline. So in the top of the slide, you see the predictions of a plain a model that has, sorry, I think my description here is wrong. You see two plots on the map of the US. One plot is the predictive error of the proposed model that uses an LSTM to model the susceptible to transition rate. So beta here, the susceptible to infectious transition rate. Whereas on the right-hand side, you see the predictions of a model that treats that parameter as a constant. What you can observe is that about an order of magnitude difference in the accuracy of the model. So that sort of highlights the fact that the simple epidemiology model that treats that beta parameter as a constant is not sufficient, is not capable for fitting the true observed trajectories and making accurate future forecasts. Finally, having a model, you can test interventions. So we can play a game and say, okay, what if we reopen retail and recreational areas in New York? How would that affect the spread of the disease in the next 2 or 3 weeks? And you see some results of the simulations indicating, a corresponding increase in the basic reproduction number, also with quantified uncertainty. All right, so I think I'm running out of time, so let me just quickly go through the last application, which basically revisits that vision that I posed earlier. And essentially here, what we try to do is to use physics-informed neural networks to filter real clinical data for 4D flow MRI. So what you see here is 4D flow MRI is an imaging technique that can extract noisy velocity fields that describe the blood flow in human arteries. So what you see here is an in vivo 4D flow data set of a human heart, and the virtual particles essentially visualize the, a noisy velocity, blood velocity field. So now the question is, can we use neural nets to try to denoise and reconstruct the underlying velocity field at any arbitrary spatiotemporal location? So essentially try to go beyond the resolution limits of MRI and try to make predictions at, continuous predictions in space and time. Can we also constrain those reconstructions to satisfy the underlying laws of physics, namely momentum and mass conservation? And on top of that, can we try to infer the geometry of the arterial walls directly from those noisy velocity measurements? And if we're able to do so, can we infer quantities that cannot be measured by MRI, such as pressure, wall shear stress, and so forth? So just quick summary, this is work in progress. We haven't published these results yet, but basically we're employing physics-informed neural networks to fit observed velocity MRI data, but at the same time try to reconstruct the flow in a way that is guaranteed to be incompressible, and also try to infer latent quantities such as the fluid pressure. And we do so by penalizing the residual of the incompressible Navier-Stokes equations for the system. And then the second component of our framework is, once we have trained a model that reconstructs the blood flow, can we post-process the predictions of those models to identify regions of no slip flow? So here the hypothesis is that the location of the arterial wall will be near those regions of no slip flow. And therefore, if we can extract candidate locations, then we can try to use those points, the location of those points, to fit a parameterization for the arterial wall geometry. So here we postulate the arterial wall can be parameterized as a tube with variable radius. And we're using two additional neural networks to try to recover what is the center line and the variable radius of that tube that regresses the data we have extracted, those candidate locations of node slip flow. Putting those two things together, we can actually try to reconstruct the flow, but also infer the wall, the location of the arterial wall. Therefore, consequently, we can compute wall shear stresses and other important biomarkers that cannot be directly measured through medical imaging. So here's just some preliminary results on this. So this is an actual real clinical data set corresponding to a porcine subject. You see a descending aorta on the left-hand side, and you see those noisy measurements collected by 4D flow MRI. And then in the middle and right-hand side panels, you see the corresponding flow reconstruction obtained by physics-informed neural networks, including also predictions for the pressure, but also a reconstruction of the arterial wall and the corresponding prediction of the wall shear stresses for this example. So I know I'm a little bit over time and I should save some time for discussion. So let me just conclude. Here I'm just having a summary slide indicating different aspects of the work that we do. And basically I'm trying to highlight that we're trying to create an interface between machine learning and classical scientific computing, for tackling realistic applications in science and engineering and synthesizing, again, observational data and physical laws. So thank you again very much for the invitation, and I look forward to your questions and discussion.
Hey, Dr. Braganetto, you're muted.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Piles, for your outstanding presentation. And I was muted. Sorry. We have time for a few questions. So.
Well, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes, Ed. So Ed has a question. Ed is my old collaborator, and so yes, we can hear you, Ed.
From what I saw in the applications, it seems that you assume that you know the physical model, the equations, but you just don't know the parameters. But the general statement doesn't require you to actually know the model, right? I mean, there are two cases here. Am I correct?
You're correct. In almost all the examples that I showed, we assume that we know an underlying physical model that may be unknown up to some unknown parameters or constants. So the physical model does not need to be precisely known, but there could be some free parameters that we can also calibrate on using the observed data.
Right. Okay. So my question is the following. When we build a controller, if we know the model, we simply can derive the controller, the optimal controller. Mm-hmm. If we don't know the model, we have free parameters, then we have a collection of possible controllers, depending on the model, okay? And so one way to proceed there is to average across the optimal solutions somehow, in some way. So in other words, average across them to produce a, on average, best performing controller. So it seems the question is, I think the advantage of your method over that is that you provide a computational means, direct computational means, rather than trying to average. Where in our case, we have to have a prior distribution on the parameter and then use the data to form a posterior. Sure. Mm-hmm. Where you directly go to the calculation. So my question is, how much data do you need? In other words, what size data sets you need to do that?
Yep, that's an excellent question. And maybe let me just go back to this slide where you see the different regimes, right. Where there's a setting where you have really few data, but very precise knowledge of the model and the underlying physics. In this regime, you would hope that you don't need any data at all because you have a precise model that you can simulate, subject, of course, to some initial or boundary conditions that need to be known. So this is the classical setting for solving, or simulating a given model that is prescribed and is fully known. Now, there's this other extreme where you may not have any underlying knowledge of a model, but you have access to a lot of data, right? And this is really the extreme where perhaps system identification methods are employed. So given a lot of data, you want to try to learn a model from the data and maybe use that down the road to design a control policy or something else. So I think the framework that I presented sort of seamlessly is trying to bridge those two extremes and even try to operate under this middle setting where you have some knowledge of the physics, maybe you have some crude model form that includes unknown parameters, and you also have some observational data. So I think that going to your question on how much data you need, that is really related to how strong of a prior you have in place. So if you do have a strong prior in place and you do know a model, then you probably can get away with very few observations and small data. But if your underlying prior is weak and you don't have, sufficient inductive biases, or you don't have an underlying model, then obviously you will need a lot of data to try to, to have an effective learning system trained.
So typically, in scientific applications, we don't have big data, we have small data. So I think that's one of the biggest pluses of this approach, is that, yeah, we cannot just collect data on the internet. But this is expensive data. And in fact, I believe that Ed has a paper on this issue. I mean, we have 2 papers on this issue. But I think this is the interesting problem is when you don't have a lot of data, and what can you do? I mean, what kind of predictions you can make?
A final comment on this, and that sort of poses the need for additional work, is that currently we don't have any guarantees on sample complexity and
Right.
surely state how much data is needed for those models to be trained and be effective.
Yeah.
So that, down the road, that's something that would be ideal, but it's something that is extremely hard to obtain for those complex deep learning models.
Exactly. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
So my question is in regards to the failure of physics-informed neural networks that you showed us before.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure the wave equation is not an outlier in the way that it's a challenge for physics-informed neural networks. So my question really is, how resilient do you think, even with the whole neural tangent kernel adaptive weights optimization, how resilient do you think physics-informed neural networks are to how resilient is the solution to this way you set up the architecture of the neural network?
Right. Well, the answer to this is, the solution is indeed very sensitive to the setup, and we need to, we're still building understanding of what would be the correct way of approaching those problems and setting up the architecture of the optimizer for a given system. So all those failure cases that you see here, in my opinion, at least so far as I understand the problem, I don't blame the framework for failing, but I blame my own understanding of, we don't have a complete understanding of how to use those tools and adapt them in this setting. So there's a series of assumptions that we typically make, and we sort of borrow some standard practices from the deep learning community that may not be appropriate in this setting. So we'll have to take a step back and revisit how we design optimizers or architectures and so forth. So I think we're still at the infancy of those techniques, and there's a lot of things to be learned. And within the next few years, I hope that the robustness of those tools and their resilience will be significantly improved, and to the point that they can be used as a tool from non-experts, that they can deploy them in realistic settings, very much like how finite element methods are used nowadays. that you don't really need to be an expert, but you can take standard simulation softwares and solve an engineering problem using finite elements.
Okay. I have one more question if you have time.
A quick question, yes.
Yeah, it's a small question. My question is just, is this method scalable to higher dimensions, or in your experience, or has it been proven successful only for 2D or 1D or 2D or 3D problems?
So many, that's a good question. So many are problems in computational physics that have to deal with physical domains, usually, involve space and time coordinates in 3 dimensions or and time. However, there exist other problems in domains like control or finance, where you can actually formulate high-dimensional PDEs like the Hamilton-Jacobi equations or Black-Scholes equations. So directly applying this PINS framework that I showed you in those high-dimensional settings faces eventually the curse of dimensionality, because essentially you need to sample collocation points to penalize your PD residual, and the higher the dimension of your space, the harder will be to sort of cover the entire space with collocation points. That being said, in scaling to high dimensions, there exists some more specialized techniques that in principle borrow this PINS setup that essentially formulate the problem, and they exploit a relation between high dimensional PDEs and systems of stochastic differential equations. So they use things like the Feynman-Kac formula and essentially try to sample trajectories from a stochastic ODE and use that as a representation for the solution of the high dimensional PDE. So in fact, there's some works from Wine and E and Maziar Raisi. The framework is not exactly the PINS framework that I showed you here, but it's actually quite similar in the sense that, again, neural networks are used to represent the solution. But the training is done by exploiting this relation between PDEs and systems of stochastic ODEs, and they have been proven to be effective for certain classes of high-dimensional PDEs.
Very nice. So we have a couple of questions in the chat box from Jean.
I can ask them if you want.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So on the NVIDIA SimNet simulation, it looks like they did a parametric PDE where they modified the height or the angle of the thermal fin and so forth. So you can really do this with a pin, have parametric, because I was under the impression you take, for example, position and time as input, but here it looks like you take, additional design variable as input to the pin. Is that correct? And you learn all of the family of solutions, therefore?
Right, absolutely. That's absolutely correct. So maybe if I switch back to this slide, in that NVIDIA example, you have a network that takes space and time as inputs, but also takes those additional 2 design variables.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially, you're trying to learn now a surrogate model for your output that depends on the space-time coordinates, but also on the design variables. And once you train that model, you can optimize it over the design variables using gradient descent to come up with the optimal shape for that heat sink.
Yeah, so I have a quick follow-up slightly related to this one, but it's more general to any pins. What happens when you have a strong material discontinuity? You use AD to compute the gradients, and you have random collocation point, but at material interface that could be severe change in diffusion coefficient and so on. Don't you have some issues at those locations?
Right, you could run into issues in settings like this, and there's 2 ways around that. If you do know or you anticipate discontinuities, you could try to design an architecture that sort of reflects that prior knowledge, and you could have, you can represent the solution as piecewise continuous within different domains, or employ domain decomposition approaches to tackle this problem. If you don't want to do domain decomposition, I think it goes back to that question that I posed here. For a given problem, what would be the correct set of features or coordinate embeddings for projecting your input? So if you do know that your underlying system has some discontinuities, either in material properties or something else, you may want to have a tailored model that accounts for that. Perhaps it could be that plain pins might work, but I'm sure that you can run into cases where you need to take that extra step and refine your model architecture or the setup of the problem to account for those difficulties.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, everyone. So we are way past the time. So we are gonna end the seminar here. So thank you very much for coming. And this is only the first in a series. So we'll be having others like this. The idea is to have them every month in the second Wednesday of every month, and we'll be announcing this. And thank you, really, and thank you to Paris, of course, for an outstanding presentation. So thank you. So we're gonna sign off now, and see you soon.